Namaste, 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 namaste. I would like to begin today by telling you something of Mother and my connection with her on the flowers. When I came to her in 1968, 7 years after I first met her, she said to me, "You don't want to come to Auroville in a few years? I feel you can do something there." And I said, "Mother, whatever is your wish." And her wish was sent to me 9 months later, not 3 years or a few years, in which she said, "I would like you to come and prepare to build the gardens of the Matrimandir." It was a time when there were so few of us in Auroville, maybe 12 or 15 people in 1969. So I began to look for a place where I could build a nursery to provide the plants for the Matrimandir gardens. It was a barren desert. There were a couple of old palm trees around and nothing else. So I looked a little further west, and I found a grove of mango trees, and there was my shade. And then I looked in the back, and there was a gigantic canyon into which, unfortunately, all the topsoil would go every year because the village farmers did not know how to bund the soil and allow the rainwater to percolate slowly, nor did they know how to stop the water from running into the canyons. So I had a protection on the west. There was a small road on the south, and there we were able to put fences and begin the work. It was arduous, unbelievably hot, no electricity in those days, lots of snakes, and we had to get water from a pump house, and we built a little tank in which everyone could swim, which was at least one good thing, cool water. And we began the work. The way I began was to bring thousands and thousands of seeds that were collected by disciples at the East-West Cultural Center, run and begun by Jyoti Priya, whose legal name was Dr. Judith Tyberg. Jyoti Priya's name was given to her by Sri Aurobindo. And she was my first contact with Mother. But that goes back into very early 1961. And today we're here to talk about the flowers. The flowers have been my entire life. I have built a garden in northeastern Georgia, and it's called Mother's Garden. And people come from all over the world to see this garden, because from February through June, it's non-stop flowering. It begins with the great magnolias. It continues with so many different flowers. There are daylilies, which we were never able to grow here or to show Mother, but many of them Mother named. And so people come to meditate there. They come to communicate with the flowers, and everyone is welcome. Now, Mother says that working with the flowers, loving the flowers, is one of the best ways of our opening the psychic being. When I began the work of this book with my wife, Mary Helen, Richard Pearson, and a lady from England, Mary, all we had was a small book by a lady, Lizelle, which named a few flowers, and we had more than 800 to do. So I used the Royal Horticultural Society's Dictionary of Gardening to identify most of these species. When the second book was created, I did all the botanical work on that also, updating the botanical names, genus, species, cultivars, hybrids, etc. But during 1970 and 1971, I made friends with horticulturists throughout the world. We had a seed exchange program with more than 100 different botanic gardens. And I made a very close contact with Dr. Marigauda in Bangalore at the Lal Bagh. And one day I said, let's bring him a van full of the seedlings that we have grown from America and other places. Well, he was so touched that he gave me 12 hibiscus from Hawaii. I began to send these to Mother, and Mother was so amazed at their beauty. I would stand by the samadhi, and I could hear her exclaim, "Superbe, magnifique." Oh, you could hear her voice. She was so happy. Now, it's very interesting that she named these flowers for Auroville. Charm of Auroville, beauty of Auroville, realization of Auroville. And then the lady who would take them up, many of you may know her. Her name is Tara Johar, and she runs the Sri Aurobindo Ashram in New Delhi. Well, Tara would take them to her and then bring down the messages to me and to Richard, and we would write them down. The thing is that Mother one day said to Tara, we need a little wider significance for the world. So we'll say they are the new creation. Beauty of the new creation, charm of the new creation, realization of the new creation, and so forth. And so these hibiscus bear two names. But it doesn't take rocket science to realize that Auroville is the new creation. Unfortunately, after spending 12 years, the first 12 years in Auroville, some people, wonderful people, left because of the time of troubles, and others began hybridizing the hibiscus because it's very easy to cross a hibiscus, and they lost the originals. I'm still trying to get them back. It's a great sadness. But during this time, from 1970 to 1972, I was able to send between 60 and 80 flowers to Mother, which she named. And one of the greatest joys for me was when she would name a flower that was so close to my soul. So the Italian basil is joy of union with the divine. And I grew another flower, and this is an interesting story. The flower was from seeds from England, and it was called Lobelia erinus, Cambridge Blue, where Sri Aurobindo studied. And I planted it, and it flowered so beautifully. What was the name Mother gave it? Does anyone know? Remembrance of Sri Aurobindo. I can't tell you how much that meant to me. Then she named the beautiful plant that the Greeks would use for their athletic ceremonies, to live only for the divine. And so many others. Once I sent her about, I think it was 10 or 12 different zinnias, and she named them all. And I'd like to read that to you because it shows how much and how close attention Mother paid to the flowers. There are actually 14 zinnias named by Mother, and the zinnia is endurance. So we have Ananda of endurance, courageous endurance, joyous endurance. I remember when I sent that to her, it was a bright coral pink flower, and the name came back, joyous endurance, which we all needed in those days because the heat was incredible. With no trees, you can imagine how hot it is. Auroville has been totally transformed because of Mother. Once a barren desert where my friends, the chief conservators of forests, said that Auroville would be uninhabitable in 50 years. Uninhabitable. The farmers could not get 2 bags of groundnuts from an acre because all the topsoil had washed away into the sea. And today we have these wonderful, wonderful people like Kirit at Gaia's Garden who have worked for years and years to create dams to hold back the water and bunds to allow the percolation of the water. And the great people of the Green Belt who lived in the most primitive circumstances to grow trees because Mother wanted a green belt around the entire city. I used to grow about 10,000 seedlings a year and give them to all the people in the green belt. And today when I go there and they show me a tree that's 60 or 70 feet high and they say, this came from you, that's the size I gave it to them. So you see the beauty of this collaboration. And I would ask all of you next year to collaborate with the flower people because they are doing such a wonderful work. How do we connect with the flowers? Well, we were allowed to write questions to Mother when we started doing the new book. And there are almost 20 pages of questions and answers. I wrote a couple to Mother also. And what did I write to her? I said, are there insects that are consciously hostile to the flowers. Why did I write that? Because we would work for a month growing all these flowers, and in 1 or 2 days, the insects would devour everything. Or the goats, or the cows. It was a very difficult time. Mother wrote back a very interesting answer, that there were no consciously hostile elements in the insects. She said they do good, they do bad. And obviously we can see the bees pollinate, other insects pollinate. We wouldn't have grains or trees, fruit trees, if there were no insects to pollinate them. And that taught me one of the greatest lessons of my life. Unlike what we have today, which is chemical sprays and fertilizers to wipe out the insects. No, that is not the answer. The answer is balance. They have their share, we have our share. Now we have to keep that balance, and we can do it most of the time organically. We can introduce insects that eat other insects, the praying mantis, the ladybug. And so we have to think more consciously now. Even though when I asked Mother, and I wrote her a 2-page letter asking her if we should not do everything organically, and you will be shocked at her answer. She said, for the flowers, he may use chemicals. Whoa. That was a shock to many people. But I will tell you why she said that, in my understanding. There are certain plants, such as orchids, that need food almost every day. And we see in the ashram a collection of hundreds and hundreds of orchids that I think flower out of desperation rather than aspiration. Because when I went to Thailand and studied with the great orchid growers there, what did I find? They were feeding a composite of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in very small doses. They said, we found a secret. If it says give 1 teaspoon of this fertilizer every 2 weeks, we divided it by 14 and gave it every day. You would not believe the joy in those orchids. I have never seen so many flowers constantly blooming. Absolutely extraordinary. Now, they would water in the morning with the fertilizer dilution, and in the afternoon, they would wash it off with clear water, because the orchid can easily absorb through its roots all that it needs. And I tell you, I have seen flowers, orchid flowers, just...
Shall we use this one?
Yeah.
I'll cut the other one.
I can use it now.
Yeah, you can use it now.
Just radiating with joy. And you know, the orchid is very, very interesting flower. It is attachment to the divine. And if you study the orchid most of the orchids put out many, many roots. And they are not parasites. They are epiphytic. They take nothing from the plant that they attach to. And they just use it as a hold so they can grow. My friend Dr. Tanikaimani from the French Institute would take me on trips into the dry forests of Tamil Nadu. And people told me, you will never see anything growing on a tamarind tree. And I would see hundreds and hundreds of orchids in full bloom on tamarind trees. Just amazing. We close ourselves very often, and we have to open more to the flowers. Now, in Mother's Garden, people come to meditate. They come to communicate with the flowers. If they want to do some work, they're welcome to do that. But it is vibrating with the joy and these messages that Mother has given them. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about our current work, because I'm working with Nilisha, who's in Sabda today because it's one of their biggest days, so she couldn't come here. We have photographed about 835 of the 845 of the 850 of the 890 flowers. We have only 40 to go. And we're going to put out books by subject. So our first book will be on protection, and it will have all the flowers of protection that Mother has named. The second book will be Beauty in Art, and it will have all the great peony flowers. Now, we asked Mother about plants that cannot grow in this climate, and she said that greenhouses would be ideal to do. Well, we haven't gotten there yet, but there are greenhouses now in America that I've been in many, many times that have an irrigation system that is a fine mist, and you can work there. But the plants, when the cuttings are placed, never suffer any dehydration. There is always humidity, 100% humidity. And so they root so easily. We have to do things like that. And then, of course, there's the story that Mother tells us about the fir trees in Algeria. Some of you know that story, I think. Can I see a show of hands? How many know that story? Oh, very few. Okay. Well, they planted fir trees on a hill in Algeria. And these little beings came to the Mother, and they said, we take care of the fir trees, but we need snow. And so Mother said, okay. And now it snows every year in Algeria. And then Mother said, when you dig the soil out for the lake around the Matrimandir, you can build a mountain on the north side and plant fir trees, and there will be snow in Auroville. It may not last for many days, but there'll be snow. If we go into these books, the second book I should tell you about. The second book is The Spiritual Significance of Flowers. And it was done by a German lady, Lilo, and I worked very closely with her, as did Bob from the archives. They worked for 10 years to photograph the flowers and put that book together. Unfortunately, it's an unwieldy book. It's in 2 volumes and very, very heavy. And what we want to do is make smaller books that people could carry around with them. You can almost put it in your pocket or your bag. And we're going to make a series of books by color. So let us say the spine here is in the color of the rainbow. If you have a blue flower, you open. If you have a blue flower, you open to the blue section. And from small to large, all the flowers that are blue that Mother named will be there. Similarly, red, orange, yellow, pink, etc. So it will be the easiest way for people to enter into this consciousness of the flowers. Why? Because the first book was done by botanical name. And if you didn't know any botanical names, how would you find anything? The second book is done by significances. And if you didn't know the significance, how will you find anything? This way, it's sure. You will find the thing. We'll do another series also on the type of plants. For example, a series on the trees, the flowers of the trees that Mother named, or the flowers of the shrubs, or the flowers of creepers that she named, vines, annuals, perennials, subshrubs, ground covers, aquatics, all the water lilies and the lotus. So these will be smaller books, probably no bigger than this, but much, much thinner. So they'll be easy to handle. How do I communicate with the flowers? It began some years ago. You know, they do speak to us. If you ever read Gerald Durrell, how many have read Gerald Durrell? Nobody. He's the most wonderful, humorous writer. And one of his great books is My Family and Other Animals. And he developed this place in Jersey, the islands of Jersey off England. His main work was with animals. And he has another book called The I, and I. And he's written about 15 or 16 books. You really should read him. In one of these books, he meets an elderly lady who tells him all about the roses. The roses do not want to be put with daisies. They don't like to be put with lower types. And she goes on and on. You keep the roses separate. And don't change the water every day. You can add new water, but don't change. And she tells him all of these things, and her house is filled with flowers. And she can hardly get out of bed, she's so old. But it's a wonderful passage. And there are people who speak of flowers, and they tell us that the best way of learning about flowers is to love them. It's the simplest way and the best way. And then one begins to communicate with them in their language, not our language. And when I speak to them and I praise their beauty, or I praise their strength, their tolerance, as we saw before in the zinnias, their endurance. I have seen zinnias in the desert blooming as I've never seen them before, without rain for 3 months, or without any water. No one watered them. That's endurance. There's another flower that's called mind. Many of you, I think, know mind. It's a common flower here and throughout India. Now, mind is completely poisonous, every part of it. The branches, the leaves, the roots, and people in South India often will eat the fruit to commit suicide. But it is mind, and at the base of each flower there is a drop of honey that is the most wonderful thing you've ever tasted. For me, that's the mind. Lots of poison, but there's a drop of honey there. There are so many flowers that have taught me how they want to grow. One of them is the Bougainvillea, or protection. If you ever tried to walk through a Bougainvillea hedge, you'll know what protection is. It'll tear you up. Now, the Bougainvillea is from Brazil, not from India. And the unique thing about it is that they have a type of monsoon also. And when it rains, the bougainvilleas are thoroughly soaked, and then they begin to dry out. And they dry out so much that the leaves even fall. After that, the rains come, and the rains are very different from groundwater because they contain micronutrients that the groundwater doesn't have. The moment the rains come, the plant puts on flowers like you've never seen, often without a leaf. My Bougainvillea guru was Mr. B.A. Rama Rao of Chennai. And he could guarantee that he would have a bougainvillea in bloom for you on your birthday. You could tell him any time you had a birthday, any day, and he would have it in bloom. He was in charge of the Madras Club's entry. Every day he had 50 bougainvilleas in full bloom, and you couldn't see a leaf. It was all joy, all beauty. So when we learn how to grow the bougainvillea, we have to replicate the way it grew in nature. So here when you have, there are different three main types of bougainvilleas, and you really only want to grow one type, and that's the type that can be grown in a container and not cover trees. So you water, fertilize, never with high nitrogen, always with higher phosphorus and potassium, because that encourages bloom, where nitrogen just encourages growth. And you don't want them to grow because they can grow so fast. So you do that. And then water. They come into bloom. And they can bloom for weeks and weeks. When they are finished blooming, you slowly start to withhold the water. No food, no fertilizer, until some people even take the plant out of the pot so the roots dry completely. I've not done that, but I've allowed them to dry thoroughly. And the leaves will often fall off. Then you begin the cycle again, watering, feeding, and they'll burst into bloom again. You can have bougainvilleas in bloom 4 times a year with this practice. And if you say even 2 or 3 weeks they bloom, well, that's a long blooming season. So many other plants reveal to us their nature, what they need, and we have to communicate with them. Sometimes it's been by trial and error, but other times it's intuitive. They tell you what they need. If you put a post here and you put a climber on that post, And then you take out the post and move it over here, a few meters away. The plant will turn there until it can find something to hold. And then you can take another post and put it here, and it will move there. So there is such a consciousness in the plants and the flowers, and such a wonderful Mother said she began naming the flowers primarily because of their fragrance. And it would be very nice if all of you could have a fragrant garden. Roses, jasmines, tuberose, all of these are rather easy to grow. And it doesn't take a lot of space. I'd like to read a few things from Mother. Flowers are very receptive, and they are happy when they are loved. The great botanist George Washington Carver once said, "Anything will give up its secrets if you love it enough." We asked Mother, why do plants fall ill, and what can we do to help them? Mother replied, "When man does not meddle, the illness of plants seems to be accidental. But man's action has upset the life of plants, even as that of animals, of course. Men have upset the life of plants and animals, and supermen have upset the life of men." Whoa. Mother says the new consciousness will be as different from man as man is from the animals. Plants have feelings. They are alive. They should not be treated brutally. I have seen plants in such pain when they have been hacked with machetes. We see it on the streets of Pondicherry every day. People don't cut a branch. They don't know where to cut it, how to cut it. When the first cyclone came in 1972 and broke the huge branch off the service tree that was facing south, I came and I saw, and the boys were cutting the wrong way. They were cutting from top down to remove the stub. And if you do that, that weight of the stub, hundreds of pounds, will tear the bark all the way down the plant and kill it. Parichand, the wonderful gardener, was there at the time, and I said, "May I go up and show them how to cut properly?" Because I had done this work with my father for many, many years. And so I went up. We cut 1/3 from the bottom, and then we cut the 2/3 from the top, and it came off beautifully. No tearing at all. Always cut from the bottom first, and then from the top. There was a wonderful man here from Spain. His name was Juan, and he was a tree surgeon. And he worked with me at the Matrimondia Gardens for 3 years. And then he trained young men. And now we have trained tree surgeons in Auroville. But they are so busy, they hardly have any time to do any other work. People call them all the time. But when the great top of the service tree over the Samadhi broke off, I went to Manoj Dasgupta, managing trustee of the ashram, and I said, "Manoj, this is not work for amateurs. let me bring the team that Juan has trained, sorry. And they came, and we worked for hours and hours. And everything was done so beautifully. Lowering everything by ropes, climbing by ropes, everything safely done. And at the end, there was a big hole in one of the branches. Kumud, who took care of Mother, sent me flowers of divine love and 2 packets, blessing packets, and I put them in the hole. Now the tree has been taken over by the government as a heritage tree, and they will care for it properly. But when I finished the pruning in 1972, Parichand came running to me and he gave me a blessing packet directly from Mother, and she said, for him to care for the tree for the rest of his life. Well, I did it for 37 years, and then it was taken away. But things happen like that. Can I remove the branches of shrubs which are overhanging and causing inconvenience to the inmates? Mother says, I cannot say yes or no. All depends on the way it is done. It is not only the welfare of the inmates that must be taken in consideration, but also the welfare of the shrubs. One time the service tree was hanging down a little bit low, and I told the fellows working there, just leave it and I will ask Mother what to do. And they're concerned about lawsuits and everything. What did Mother say? They must learn to bow. But they cut it anyway. Okay, next. The only thing I insist upon is care, gentleness, and consideration, as you would have for a living being. For the plants are living, and they feel and suffer. There have been many, many studies by scientists, and they have found that a tree growing 50 miles away from another group of trees is growing in a place where it cannot sustain itself. Soil is wrong, water is wrong, nutrients are wrong, and the tree is thriving. They began to dig very carefully those 50 miles, and they found that this grove of trees was supplying a fungus to that single tree, caring for it. If we could begin to understand this connectiveness of life, in preparing the beds, flower beds, it may be found necessary to cut away some roots of the trees. What does Mother say? This is not possible. No roots of trees must be cut. Apart from that, if the trees are respected, you can prepare these beds. Now, during the meditation times in the ashram, they would lay mats down so many people could come. But the roots were protruding. And I worked with many ashramites to excavate the area below, and using old tires and things We lowered those roots so that there are none protruding today, and the tree is fine. And by the way, if you ever want to guide a plant, do not use wire. If you need to use wire or a turnbuckle to tighten and straighten a plant, take an old tire tube or a tire, bicycle tire, and put that around the plant, and then put the wire around that and tighten it. And it will never cut into the plant at all. This is the key thing, very important. Mother says, oh, here's my question. Are there forces directly hostile to vegetal nature? Are insects a manifestation of these forces? Mother replies, there do not seem to exist forces consciously and voluntarily hostile to the vegetal kingdom. Insects do harm because they feed on plants, but in this way they serve them also. Both things are there, good and bad, without any conscious will. They do good, they do harm, without knowing it. That was such a lesson for me. I talked to you about balance before. This understanding that everything in the universe is so interconnected that we have to respect every aspect. You cannot imagine how much work the worms do in the earth. This small, insignificant creature creates, of course, now we have vermicompost, which is some of the best compost, by putting worms into vegetation. And they just work it over and work it over and work it over until you have this marvelous compost. When I began the composting work in the Matrimandir, we had many, many trees to plant in an area we call the outer gardens. So we needed a lot of compost. And so I brought many things from the US in a huge trailer, and we started the work. Now, composting, I just want to give you a very brief overview, is not letting things rot. That is not composting. Composting has 4 primary ingredients: carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and water. And they all have to be done in the proper way. You only need 1 part of nitrogen for every 25 parts of carbon. Carbon is dead leaves, dead grasses, anything like that. Only 1 part of nitrogen. And you can use cow dung, it's perfect. Then it needs water, because without water, there are different bacteria that live at different temperatures, and you have to give them all what they need. The main thing for me, the main discovery I made, was oxygen. If you don't have enough, if the oxygen is depleted rapidly by these bacteria, then you have to turn the pile every few days. But I was given this: put big bamboo poles every meter apart, and then build the pile around that. When the pile is finished at about man's height, take the poles out and start the next pile. And then the oxygen comes through, all the air is there, and the composting is so rapid, you would be amazed. In 3 or 4 weeks, you can have wonderful compost. Back to Mother. How can flowers help us in our life and in our yoga? Mother says, flowers teach us the charm of silence, and also the self-giving that demands nothing in exchange. Love of flowers is a valuable help for finding and uniting with the psychic. Question. You have written, love of flowers is a valuable help for finding and uniting with the psychic. Could you explain this more in detail? Mother says, since flowers are the manifestation of the psychic in the vegetal kingdom, love of flowers would mean that one is drawn by the psychic vibrations and consequently by the psychic in one's own self. When you are receptive to the psychic vibration, that puts you in a more intimate contact with the psychic in your own self. Perhaps the beauty of flowers, too, is a means used by nature to awaken in human beings the attraction for the psychic. Question. What is the best way of opening ourselves to the deep influence of flowers? Mother. It is to love them. If you can enter into psychic contact with them, then that would be perfect. How can one enter into psychic contact with flowers? Mother. When one is in conscious contact with one's own psychic, one becomes aware of an impersonal psychic behind the whole creation, and then through this one can enter into contact with flowers and know the psychic prayer they represent. If we can consciously connect with the beauty of this rose, if we can unite with it, if we can become the rose, its fragrance, the beauty of its petals, the power of its significance, which is generally love. There are many roses Mother's named, and most of them are about love. Now, I've gone on and on for almost an hour, and I could go on for hours more, but I think you need to have lunch. So, thank you so much. And anytime you want to meet with me or talk about flowers, I'm always available, because there is nothing more important for me than this connection with nature and the connection with the great souls such as John Muir, George Washington Carver, Luther Burbank. Luther Burbank could walk down a row of 10,000 seedlings of a fruit tree and just looking at them immediately tell you the two that would be superior. We have a ways to go. Let's go.